You ain't nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time. You ain't nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time. Well, you ain't never gonna rap it, and you ain't no friend of
In the summer of my 4th year, I stood in front of that little white house with the white picket fence, biting into half a slice of watermelon. Mom's brownie camera caught me in mid-bite. I held it with both hands, playing it, every sweet morsel, every succulent red bite. You could see by the fingering, I knew the tune well. I took seeds as they spitting and swallowing. I took seeds as they came. A true sideman, improvising each piece. Dark green or striped, oblong or round. I played them all equally. Juice dripping down my shirt and feeling all right. Now the world's different. The tune's not the same. I heard on TV a newscaster proclaim, contamination in the watermelon patch. Watermelons laced with TNT. The farmers used groundwater from the bomb factory site. So beware, young mothers. Your seed-spitting 4-year-olds don't jostle. If deep rumblings come from within, it's probably more than just a bellyache. Handle them well. And while waiting for the doctor, call the bomb dismantling squad, 1-800-543-8088. Yeah. I wrote that back in 1989. Wow, a long time ago.
Wow.
But I still like water. One sat in his overstuffed chair, eyebrows furrowed, looking out at his window on the world. In his last days, he turned and watched images on TV while we sat huddled together on the couch, caught in the wonder of the electronic image and of the hum that went on inside that head. The other, a small man with deep-set eyes framed in wire rims, was always trailing the shadow of a different address in a different town in a distant time. In his last days, after grandmother's death, he slowly traced the streets of our small town, winding his way back into the past. Our lives switched by in adolescent flurry. Carelessly, we drove by those drawn Venetian blinds. Today, we sit in front of the TV, and once in a while, we get up and walk those same streets, dreaming of grandchildren and of what's in the ground on the hill over our town. Well, thank you for coming. The last time I was here was at Sheridan High School's 55th high school reunion, and Greg was shooting video then and everything, and we had quite a group of Sheridanites together then and everything. Anyway, I'm glad you could make it, and I'm glad that I could make it, and I've got a thing I want to do. I'm not going to just talk about the new book. I want to also talk about, well, I've got some stories from the old one I want to share with you. I've shared them with some people and they seem to enjoy them, so I said, okay. All right, William Stafford, I worked with him for about 9 years on making documentaries. And it was like working with Buddha for 9 years. He was just, I was amazed how much I learned constantly from Stafford. You know, I never got a PhD, but I think from Stafford it was equal to a PhD. One time I was in filming with him. Hello, Dorothy. Dorothy Agee. Yeah, Mike. Hi. Yeah, come on in and sit down. I'll hold on a second here until everybody gets down. It's all right, Joyce. This is Joyce and Mike and Dorothy Agee, and of course from Agee's Market, Norman's wife at the time. And when I graduated from Sheridan High School, I went to work for Agee's Market for about a year, and I worked with Norman, and I worked with Dorothy, and it was great fun. And then I went down to California. After that, I was hoping to go to college, junior college down there, and I went to work for a Lucky Store down there, and started junior college in California, and got interested in literature and in writing. Actually, the big thing I wanted to do then as a kid was I wanted to be a singer. I wanted to be a professional singer. And, I shouldn't tell you the story, but I will anyway. I think it was was it 57 or 58? I went to Portland to the Paramount Theater, and they had an Elvis contest. And so I picked out a song from one of Elvis's film called "You're So Square," and anyway, so I ended up winning the state championship from Paramount Theater, you know, and then they gave me a gold watch, and then there was a local television program called High Time on, and I got to perform my Elvis song on High Time too. And so that summer I was picking beans for aldermans out in the Dayton area all the time. And all the time I would have these Portland girls come out, and they would look at me and, is that the guy? So I was in seventh heaven there for a while, but once I started teaching, I never mentioned at Howard's. I don't think any of my students knew about it, and I wanted to keep it that way. All right, okay. Let me go back to what I was doing. I was shooting a documentary at Willamette University of William Stafford, and he was getting up in front of an English class, and he was about ready to lecture them, and so I was shooting away, and he came out with a statement. He said, "The research for what you're writing is your whole life." And whoa, my God. Yes, it is, you know. And so I learned more than that English class did that day, I think, and I'll never forget Bill Stafford in that statement. Research for what you're doing is your whole, for your writing is your whole life. And you know, I was born, in Vinville Hospital in 1942, but I came home to a house on 204 Southwest Water Street, 2 blocks from here. And Karen, after she finished Following the Wrong God Home with me, I took her around to a tour of all the spots that were in that novel in Sheridan. And the first one we stopped down was a little house on Water Street. And then I said, well, come on up, I'm going to show you something right next to the porch. So we walked up the sidewalk and looked down, and there was a little footprint in the shoe, and it said, Mikey on it. And the people came out of the house like, what the hell, what are you doing here, you know? And then actually half a block down there was the former Mennonite church. Most people didn't know that, but Karen and I took photographs of the Mennonite church too. All right. Speaking of the research for what you're writing is your whole life, I started writing this novel in the 4th grade. All right, I was going to grade school at Chapman Grade School. And I was in Mrs. Butler's class, and I started writing about Johnny Mullen. That was in the 4th grade in 1952. And it's taken me a couple days to finish the novel. And anyway, I think it's so true. And one thing I'd like to say is I'm the son of a junk man from Sheridan, Oregon. My grandfather, Street, was a junk man, and he made a lot of money at it. But Grandma and Grandpa came out from Tennessee in 1909, and they had 13 children in Sheridan, and 10 of them survived, and my mother was the youngest of the 13. And she ended up as my grandparents' chauffeur around Sheridan. And I went along with her because I was the oldest son. I was the oldest of 4 children of Alice and Clayton Markee in Sheridan. And my father was drafted into the Army in late 1944. And I was about 2 years old at the time, and I remember I've got all kinds of pictures. My mother was a prolific photo taker, and she has all these photos of me with Army uniforms at 2 years old and hats on and everything with my dad, and then my dad went off to war. He went into combat with the 34th Infantry in the Philippines, and after the first battle, they had devastating losses, and my father was selected out of several men to be a medic, because a lot of medics had been killed in this first battle, and so my father became a medic in the infantry, and he served the rest of the war as a medic. And at the end of the war, he ended up serving occupation in Japan, close to Hiroshima. And he came home in 1946. I have one photograph here of my dad. Let's see, it's down below. It's takes place in our garden there, and I'm there on my knees with Dad in the garden in the summer of 1947, and it's the first garden that my dad worked on and made after he came back to the war. He wouldn't talk about the war much. He didn't like talking about it. But a friend of his wrote a book about all of those experiences and being a medic. And so anytime I wanted to know about what my father did, I just read his friend's book, and it really came in handy. All right, I worked for AG's for about a year, and then I went to California, and I went to work for Lucky Stores down there, and I started in junior college. I started to Diablo Valley JC in the Bay Area there around Concord and Walnut Creek. And I started getting interested in literature and writing about that time. And so I came back up to Oregon then that fall, and I decided I wanted to go back to college. And earlier, before most of you got here today, I met a fellow that I worked with at Mayfair Market in Salem, in McVinville, and he worked with me there all the time. And so I started working there, and I was married to Karen Chamberlain then, and I decided I wanted to go back to college. So I went to work. Mayfair, I'd worked 35 hours a week. And then I would commute to Monmouth from McVinville, where I was living, and go to class all day long. And then I would come home and work at Mayfair at night. So I worked 35 hours a week at Mayfair. I took a full schedule at college, at Oregon College of Education, and I commuted 30 miles a day, and I did that for 4 years until I graduated from college. And I had a wonderful faculty in the English department when I was working at OCE. Some of these guys, Dr. Bellamy, he used this voice. He sounded like Shakespeare all the time, and he was constantly reading Shakespeare. And he was an amazing professor. When I was in graduate school, after I finished graduating, I was working at McNary High School in Keizer in Salem, and I've been teaching full time. In fact, in my book, Following the Wrong God Home, the principal of the school is Mr. Davenport. Well, it just so happens that at McNary High School in Salem, Mr. Davenport was the vice principal and the hiring principal, and he was the one that hired me to teach English at McNary High School. So I was lucky. Then I started graduate school in the summer, and I got interested in film. I started enrolling in film study classes and filmmaking classes in graduate school. So I initiated new classes at McNary High School in film studies and filmmaking, and I taught students how to make Super 8 films when I first got started. And with Super 8, you had to cut the shots apart. It's not like video. It's a lot of work. And so the first film I made was about the Street family, a reunion. I shot it in my folks' backyard in Super 8. And then the second one I made, it becomes sort of famous in Sheridan. It's an hour-long documentary on the class in 1960 from Sheridan High School. And all I used in that thing was the rock and roll from the period, you know, and starting with the first grade all the way through graduation. And what I used Larry Pratt. He was a classmate of mine, and then I borrowed my old 49 Merc that I used to own from them, and we drove it around Sheridan to all these places and all the schools and everything, and had this rock and roll playing in the background, and you got to see all the kids lined up in the first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade, all the way up through graduation and everything. And so people today, they say, oh, in fact, my brother Pat said, I want that reunion film because I want pictures of the Merc. Well, I gave the Mercury, the 49 Merc that I'd customized to my brother Pat, and he sold it to a friend of his. Anyway, he doesn't have any pictures of it, so he wants that video of Sheridan's graduation. So, in the 70s, I started, after the reunion and everything, and that documentary, I started writing a screenplay, feature-length screenplay. And it's sort of based on my grandpa's street, and also based on a junk man that was in South Salem. I'd go out and dump garbage on the weekend and that sort of thing. And this little old guy would come around from pickup to pickup and trunk and point at something and want that, and so you'd give it to him and he'd haul it away with his junk, and I said, that would make a great screenplay. So I wrote my first screenplay about Junkman, about my grandfather, and I started off with a character sketch about him. All right, so this was in 75, 76, something like that. I wrote it, and here's Uncle Sam's character sketch. An old man, 70, perhaps even 80 years old. He is mute, withdrawn from the speaking world, but when alone, a sporadic, spontaneous, and tender monologue goes on between himself and his junk, between himself and his past. He is in the early stages of senility, but at times his mind, his vision of the world is crystal clear, is almost profound. Physically, he's a wreck. Emaciated, pale, stooped, he shuffles between his decaying clapboard shack and the sanitary landfill like a withered Charlie Chaplin, wearing a World War II helmet liner, a red and blue checkered wool mackinaw, a tattered and greasy blue chambray work shirt, suspenders, gray long johns, baggy trousers, and wretched 9-inch hard-toed work boots with laces that are always untied, always flopping as he shuffles through the junk. He meanders through the maze unshaven, often forgetting to put his false teeth in. Brown tobacco spittle streaming down the side of his mouth, sticking to his unshaven chin. That's about two-thirds of the description. It gets worse. It gets worse from there. All right, now I want to read you the first page of the screenplay, Junkman. All right. Exterior, sanitary landfill, dawn. Trash, yards and yards of trash come crashing down into a pit. The moaning of motors mixes and mingles with the roar of the falling garbage. The grunting of a bulldozer can be heard as an ominous blade looms above, shoving trash into a pit. Beyond the cascading trash and the grunting bulldozer, standing atop the largest of several mounds of trash, there appears to be a soldier struggling like some victorious Marine to raise a pole. Gradually, we see that it is an old man wearing a World War II helmet liner, and that he is moving bits of trash with a pole. The sound of an approaching garbage truck is heard. The old man turns, looks in the direction of the approaching truck, looks back into the pit, drops his pole, and walks into the pit. A large white garbage truck backs toward the edge of the pit and stops. A stocky man, about 35, gets out of the driver's side and walks to the rear of the truck. Another older fat man appears on the other side of the truck. Together they open the rear gate of the truck. A stocky man, "Hey, old man!" Sam continues digging through the trash. "You better get your withered ass out of there. I'm about to make a deposit." The fat man laughs. "Sam, you default bastard, I'll give you 10 seconds and then I'm dumping it. We ain't running no playground for the aged here." The fat man laughs. Sam picks up an object, a douche bag complete with rubber hose, and holding it up towards the two men standing at the edge of the pit, gives them a finger with it. Stocky man, "Damn old pervert, I'll fix ya." The stocky man strides towards the cab of the truck. He gets in the cab, starts the engine, jerking the engine into reverse. The whine of the motor that will remove the garbage from the truck can be heard. The fat man jumps in on the running board of the truck and then begins arguing with the stocky man. Suddenly, the engine of the truck stops. And that's the end of the first page. So I had a filmmaker friend of mine that I'd been working with quite a bit about stuff, and he wanted to read it, so he read it, and he said, "Dan, I like that, Mike. I'd like to make a movie of it." So he got a hold of this other guy, and they said, "Yeah, we want to make a feature out of it." And I said, "Great, go ahead. So they started working on it, went on for about 6-9 months, and they finally said, "Well, we aren't going to get the money." And I said, "Well, okay." So that was sort of the end of that screenplay. So then I started writing a second screenplay. And the second one, I was researching the marijuana industry. This was in the 70s again, okay? Marijuana industries in southern Oregon and northern California. And I did a lot of research. I would go to head shops and all kinds of places around Salem and start looking, and once in a while one of my students would show up and I said, "Oh shit," so I had to go hide somewhere. So all I needed is for my students to think I was a damn dope addict or something. So I had to really be careful about when I was out in these places getting this stuff. Well, anyway, I started writing the screenplay, and I took trips down to southern Oregon and looked around these places where they'd been growing it and all of that sort of thing. And I gained a lot, and so I finally finished Force of the Night, and I felt pretty good about it. So I had an uncle, Virgil, that worked for Murphy logging company out of Willamina and Sheridan and Portland, and he had just, Michael Markee, the son of him, had just made a film called St. Helens. And I don't know whether any of you remember St. Helens, but it was about St. Helens blowing its top, and it starred Art Carney, and it was rather successful. So I asked my uncle Virgil if he would call up Murphy and see if he could get some connection, tell him I had a couple of screenplays I wanted to share. So he calls up Michael Markee, and Murphy invites me up for a meeting, and we start talking and everything, and he said, well, leave your screenplays here, and I'll go through them and see how they look and everything. So he did, and he started having me write and rewrite, and every time I rewrote it, I felt less and less about it, and I didn't want any part of it. So I finally just quit. And then about 6 months later, I looked in the paper and read where Michael Markee was about ready to make a movie out of a senior citizen who was trying to break out of a out of a rest home, and that was right out of my screenplay, Junkman. So I said, all right. So I called up Murphy's office right then and said, look, I want my screenplays back right now. So I get them back, all packaged with the date when it was shipped and all of that. And I said, okay, I won't open now, and if Murphy starts that thing, I'm gonna sue his ass. So I never did see him where they supposedly made that movie, but somebody said they did, but I didn't sue him. All right. I had one more adventure with screenplays. I vowed that no more writing screenplays. The hell with this stuff. It's a losing battle with screenplays. And then one night I got a call from Michael Gonzalez was his name, and he got a job in L.A. working on a feature-length film. And so one night he calls me up and he said, Mr. Markee? I said, yeah, Mike, what's up? And he said, well, I have a screenplay I want you to read and maybe rewrite for me. And I said, a screenplay? What's it about, Mike? He says, well, it's about gang warfare in L.A. And I said, what the? I don't know anything about L.A. and even less about gang warfare. Why should I care? And he said, let me send it to you. I want you to read the thing. So I said, okay, send it to me and I'll read the thing. So I read it, and then the next day I called him up and I said, Mike, you're right. This is like Walt Disney Goes to Gangland or something. And he just laughed. He thought that was as funny as hell. He said, well, I want you to do something with it. Give it some balls. Yeah. Give it some strength. And I said, all right, I'll see what I can do. So I started, I wasn't going to write any more screenplays, but here I am writing it again. So I'm writing away on it. I get to about 2/3 of the way through, and one night Mike calls me up and he says, Mr. Markee, you sicko. And I said, is that tough enough for you, Mike? And he says, too damn tough. I said, well, what can we do about it? And then he invited me to come down and meet the filmmaker. Her name was Celia Fox, and she was head of Foxy Films, and she was one foxy lady. young, beautiful girl. Anyway, so I got to go down and visit and talk to them and start writing away on it and everything. And then Mike got tired of working with her. He said, this is going nowhere. He said, let's just take the screenplay away from her and go make it ourselves. I said, what do you mean, make it ourselves, Mike? Where are you going to get the money? She's got a rich father. She's about ready to spend $15 million on that film. Do you have that kind of money? I don't have that kind of money. So he said, I'm quit. I've had it. So I worked on with her for a while on a thing, and then I vowed to myself that, well, you know, I can't do it either. I just walked away from it. I said, no more. So then I heard that she was actually making a $15 million film now, my screenplay. And she had this Canadian writer working on it too. And so I got a hold of a lawyer and I said, I worked for a full year really hard on the screenplay and I didn't get a cent. Get me some money. So I was amazed. They did make the movie, and I ended up getting $70,000 out of it. So that wasn't bad for a screenplay. Well, anyway, now if you want to see, the title is Days of Wrath. I have a DVD copy of it, and I have seen the film. And it's, yeah. I called up Celia Fox and I said, Celia, why did you cut all the scenes out of La Brea tar pits? Do you know where La Brea tar pits are? Right in the middle of LA. And it's a very famous place for kids. They take busloads of kids and everything because all of these ancient creatures went in there and got in this oily mud and they preyed on each other. And I said, God, that's just like gangs preying on each other. And so we have these gangs fighting in the Brea tar pits while children are coming around and visiting the place and everything. And it's just like the creatures before. And I said, why didn't you use it? She said, we didn't have enough money. So, if you want to see La Brea tar pits, type it up on your computer. It'll come up the title. And actually, I get title screenplay reference after the second or third time. My name's on the thing too. At least I got $70,000. And I said, no more screenplays. And now I'll be damned if I'm going to write another screenplay about anything. I did. I ended up writing about 8 screenplays. I wrote one with my brother, Pat. He's UPS man, and he was great at telling stories and everything. So I just write these stories down as fast as I can. And so then I eventually wrote a screenplay called Back Roads with Big Brown. And I had a former student of mine read it the other day, and he said, damn, that's the best screenplay you've written, Mike. And I said, well, I don't know. And then I showed it to my brother Pat, and he said, and this was right in front of his wife-to-be, and he read it and he said, that's not me. Anyway, so he wouldn't pay any attention to the thing either. And then I wrote another screenplay about William Stafford, and The Darkness Around Us was the title of the thing. And I really liked it, but the thing is, I took Bill Stafford, who was a conscientious objector during World War II, and he wanted to go to the camp on the southern Oregon coast during the war. And that's where all the writers were going. And when he applied, the head of the camp said, I'm not going to take that writer in. You think I'm a fool? All we need is more writers in here. And so they didn't take him. Well, anyway, I still use that as that's where he met his wife, and that's where he did all of his CO work, and I thought, pretty damn good screenplay, actually. And then I took it up to all of the people at Lewis and Clark College, where the Stafford collection is and everything, and gave it to them, and they looked at it and said, "This isn't Bill Stafford. He didn't go to the Oregon coast." I said, "But he wanted to. He might have. This is, what if he did go?" And they said, "No, we don't like it." So they just sort of threw it away in the trash or some damn thing. Anyway, and then one other one that, a screenplay, I keep talking screenplay, so I shouldn't do it. That I really liked was the Cedar Thief. And this is a story about, a guy on the Salmon River. I went up and he had a wood that he was selling there and everything, and we started talking. I was buying wood for my fireplace, and he said, "You know, when I was a kid, I was a cedar thief." I said, "What?" He said, "A cedar thief." I said, "What's a cedar thief?" He said, "Well, my dad would work as a Jippo logger all the time, and he never made enough money, so at night he would get me to go out with him in his truck, and we would go out in the forest and cut down a cedar tree and clip it together and then go in and sell it and make thousands of dollars on it." I said, "Ooh, that's a good story. I think I'd like to write about it." So I wrote a screenplay called The Cedar Thief, and I had it placed in Willamina, Oregon, on the thing, and the father was also a singer, a Western singer, and he sang at the local bar at night and everything. And then they would take off every time he needed money, and they would go out and cut cedar on the thing. And I said, "God, that's a good story. I really like that." And so, anyway, right now I'm converting it into prose. I thought, the hell with the screenplay. I'd love to have it made into a movie, but for right now I'm going to make it into a small book. It's only going to be about 80, 90 pages long, but I think high school kids would really like to read it, and maybe even junior high, except for the swearing. All right. Well, the last thing, before I get in reading a couple things out of the novel, is that I became good friends with the Mennonites in Sheridan. When I wrote the first book, after I finished and got it out around Sheridan and stuff, my brother came to me and said, "What did you write in that book about Mennonites?" I said, "Well, nothing. I mean, they were just against these kids because they were pro-war and everything and that sort of thing." He said, "Well, they put a ban on you in that book in Sheridan." I said, "They did." And so, if you read "Following the Wrong God Home," the Mennonites are the heroes in it. Anyway, Dorothy Stutzman was a Mennonite gal that I met when I was 5 years old. My mom would take me out prune picking with her outside of Sheridan, and Dorothy's sister was always out there, and we were making eyes at each other all the time. I was 5 years old and everything like that. And we became good friends and went to high school together and graduated together. And then I guess it was not until 1989, the first Bible school I went to was the Mennonite Bible School when I was 9 years old. And I really liked the Mennonite place and everything in Sheridan. Well, in '89, I called up Dorothy. She was living in Albany, and she owned a florist shop there. And I asked her if she'd do a taped interview with me about her family and her religion. And she said, "Sure, come on over." So I went over, set up luncheon with her, and I taped 2 hours and got some great material from her and that sort of thing. And then I also got from her a interview with her minister from Western Mennonite, and his name was Marvel Lynn. And I went to him, and the first thing I asked him was, what if a young Mennonite girl fell in love with a non-Mennonite young soldier about to be shipped off to war and wanted to marry him? And he answered back, it wouldn't happen. And then I repeated, I said, but what if it did? What if it did? He said, it wouldn't happen. I looked at him kind of smugly and I said, I believe I have my story. So anyway, I decided to write the novel about 4 young teenage boys living in Sheridan off of Monroe Street together here, and they have a fort that looks right into the Mennonite church, and they're always looking at them, see if they're holy rolling or anything and doing things, and the Mennonites aren't very happy with these kids. Well, as you probably know, those of you who've read Sunday's Children, as they threw a firecracker, a big one, right in the middle of the church, right in front of the minister during the service on the thing, and that starts off the war on the thing in Sunday's Children. All right, so I created 14-year-old boys, 4 of them, and they were going to be my main characters at dealing with the Mennonites and everything. And I was interested in, first of all, a point of view. I was tired of writing second-person point of view with screenplays, and I wanted to get the first-person point of view, but also the right voice, creating a strong point of view, almost obsessive, but a loving and caring one too. So I picked out 2 characters that really influenced me in writing fiction. One of them was Huckleberry Finn, by Mark Twain. And Hemingway said that all modern American literature comes from one book by Mark Twain, Huckleberry Finn. And the second one I wanted to use the character was Holden Caulfield, the main character in Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. And I also wanted to include a cross-section of the community with many people showing and sharing stories and sufferings of many kinds, and as a result of World War II. And finally, I wanted a love story to recreate Johnny Mullen's life and legend. So I decided I wanted to start the novel, Somebody's Child. And so I said, well, what's the best way to probably start that thing? And I was looking through a lot of my mother's photographs, and there's one of my grandfather where he's standing right next to his woodpile with an axe. And I said, God, that's a good picture of Grandpa. I think maybe I should start the first page describing Grandpa, what he's doing. So I said, okay, well, here's a little better photograph in action. There's Grandpa in his woodpile. All right, here's the opening of Sunday's Children. Grandpa, I can see him now, in his long sleeve white shirt and garters holding him up, wearing a tie and a dark brown fedora and dress slacks, chewing on a long black Italian stogie and swearing under his breath as he swings a double-bladed axe with authority, splitting the planar round in half. Ha! What a picture he made in 1944 from my mother's Hawkeye Brownie camera. In the first place, Who chops wood wearing a tie and a white dress shirt and in a fedora? And he's still doing it. He's out there right now, swinging like he's Zeus, dividing the universe into firewood chunks. Only now he's looking for me to do his chopping, calling, "Stevie, where are you, boy? I need ya." In 1944, when the photo was taken, he needed his sons who were off to war. 4 of them. One was a medic in Europe, another a GI in the Philippines, the third a truck driver in the U.S. Army in Greenland, and the fourth a shipyard worker in Portland building Liberty ships. And the funny thing is that they all came back. All 4 of the fools. Can you figure it? Luck, I say, if only my father had had such luck. "Stevie, get over here." I see him coming into the pantry and I try to duck out, but before I can exit, he has me by the back of my shirt, dragging me outside. He looks at me over his dark furrowed eyebrows and his wrinkled bare face. "Get out there and chop your grandma's wood." I looked him in the eye and I knew he meant, "Gee, Grandpa, it's a holiday, and there's a parade at 1. Start now, there's plenty of time before the parade. And when you get done there, take a load of kindling to your grandma for the kitchen stove." He handed me the axe and strode off like Zeus on a mission, preparing to pounce on some unsuspecting lady in the neighborhood. Maybe that's why he dressed as he did, chopping wood. He never knew when a nice-looking lady would saunter by on her way to the store or something, and he always wanted to be ready. That's my grandpa. All right, I've got one more story I want to read you about Grandpa. It's I guess you might say it could be risque, but it really isn't. All right, so I'm going to read this. The next morning, Grandpa was true to his word. He was shaking me out of bed at 8, telling me we had to take care of the chickens and clean off the roost. I told him I'd take my eggs over easy and roll over. Then he pulled off the covers and pulled me out of bed. I wanted no part of this detail, but I promised. Grandpa had been raising chickens for as long as I could remember, probably as far back as Tennessee, before they moved out here to Oregon in 1909. I remember when they had a coop in the lot behind our little house over on Water Street. Now Grandpa had them over behind a junk barn. Always Rhode Island reds with hens that laid big brown eggs, always with double yolks, twins in the chicken world. Last Easter, Grandpa had given Ginny and me a chick of our own. I don't really know why. There was always a hen or two running around with a brood of the things in the yard, but I guess Grandpa wanted us to identify more with the critters so we wouldn't feel so bad about having to take care of them. Anyway, I got a spunky little rooster and Jenny got a bantam hen. They were cute for a while, but then they grew up. I named the rooster Patton because he was such a mean bastard. He was always picking on the other roosters and fighting and chasing them around the yard, and he never stopped riding the hens. He was a 4-star general of the yard. He was always flying out of the yard whenever he felt like it. Grandpa kept saying he was going to kill the SOB and have him for dinner. I just laughed. Chicken reminded me a lot of Grandpa. I put on my old jacket, my rubber boots, and walked behind the junk barn with Grandpa. At least it wasn't raining, but it was still wet and muddy. Grandpa took a basket and went to the coop to gather eggs, while I took a hoe to the roost and scraped off the crap, emptying it into a metal tub. I didn't want eggs for breakfast, thank you. After I finished, Grandpa and I both went into the yard to put feed and fresh water into the troughs. Grandpa lit up a stogie, and it was about and was standing in the corner of the yard preparing to take a pee when I saw General Patton move toward him. I'd never seen a little cock move so fast. Grandpa let out a howl, bent over, pants unzipped, face contorted and swearing furiously. He staggered towards the door of the yard. I heard him moaning all the way to the house. General Patton, you've done it now, I said. Next thing I knew, I could hear Grandma yelling all the way from the house, and in a couple of minutes I saw her come striding out of the yard across the street to the chicken coop. She knew the general as well as I did. She threw open the door of the yard. "Where is he?" she said. I pointed to the corner of the yard where the bird was strutting nonchalantly. Then she was on him. He flew to the top of the fence, but Grandma grabbed him, holding both claws tightly with her gloved right hand before he could fly out the top. With her other hand, she opened the empty feed sack and thrust the cock into it before he could let out a squawk. I'd never seen Grandma move so fast. I was impressed. She was protecting the family jewels. I was just glad Grandpa got it, not me. Stupid damn bird. I followed Grandma out of the yard to a chopping block she had set up under the old apple tree close to the chicken shed. From the time I was 5, I remember Grandma's skill at slaughtering chickens. She had 2 basic methods she used depending on the bird and her inclination. First, there was the wringing the neck method. Grandma would get hold of the chicken by the legs with one hand, and then she'd grab the neck from behind with the other and start a twirling motion. That was something to watch. The head flew one way, the body another, flopping and twitching along the ground, blood flying every which way like specks of shrapnel. She was a master of the technique, but today she carried the double-bladed axe with her, the other method. Grandma pulled a knife from her apron and cut the twine that held the feed sack and opened the bag. General Patton squawked. In quick, deft moves, she pulled the bird from the bag, flopped the head on the block, wings flapping, bird shrieking. I turned my head and heard the thud of the axe, felt the blood spatter on my arms and neck, turned and watched the thrashing of the body in the grass, watched Grandma pour steaming water into a large pan, watched her retrieve the carcass and drop it into the water. The head lay beside the chopping block in the dirt, comb still high and perfectly ridged, smeared with blood. There would be no taps for General Patton. He was headed for the kettle. I felt sad about the bird. After all, he did belong to me, and he had a kind of courage and bravado. That evening, the family ate General Patton. Grandpa sat at the head of the table, obviously still in pain, a large white bib tucked at his chin, knife and fork on edge, clenched tightly in both hands. He was ready to eat chicken. Aunt Alice and Uncle Clayton were sitting at the table with their little boy Patrick. Jenny sat by Grandma, next to Grandpa. I didn't know what possessed me, but while the food was being passed around, I stood at the table, interrupting the conversation, and started singing. I love my rooster loves me. I love my rooster by the cottonwood tree. By the time I finished the third line of the lyric, Grandpa was standing up at the table, knife and fork still in his hand, and he started running after me, chasing me around the large dining room table. I kept singing and running. My little rooster goes cock-a-doodle-doo. Everyone in the room was laughing except Grandpa as I sang and ran. Grandpa still chasing me, but more slowly and with a limp, still shaking his fork and knife. Dee-doodle, 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 dee-doo. All right, one more story, okay? After dinner, Uncle Bud and Cousin Eddie got out their guitars and tuned them while the women cleaned up the table and did the dishes, and the kids ran around the house, upstairs and down, playing games and yelling and screaming, and the men went into the living room and smoked and talked and drank some more. I went upstairs to check on Dad's footlocker and covered it with some of my clothes. I didn't want anything more to disappear out of it. Then I went downstairs and on the way told the little kids to stay out of my room and leave my things alone. Bud and Eddie were strumming away on their six strings in the living room, singing in two-part harmony to Crawdad Hole, a favorite old-time song of mine since I could first remember. Probably since I could first remember, I could remember in the summer we'd always go down to the ditches or creeks and try to gate crawfish. As a little kid, I fell in more times than I caught anything, but I remember catching one of the slippery, pinching, bug-eyed creatures once in a while. You get a line and I'll get a pole, honey. You get a line and I'll get a pole, babe. You get a line and I'll get a pole. We'll all go down to the Crawdad Hole, honey, baby mine. I remember one summer, Cousin Ed had this big crab trap he brought over from the coast and filled it with fish heads and took it down below the bridge in town to the river while all the kids in the neighborhood followed him, watching every move he made. He found a deep hole and threw the trap in, hanging it onto a rope. Then he anchored it to a fair-sized cottonwood tree. Satisfied with his work, he came over to Grandpa's and told Grandpa to get a couple gallons of cheap wine, put them in one of Grandma's canners, and stoke up the fire in the kitchen stove and get the wine boiling because we were gonna eat crawdads. In a couple hours, Eddie went back, and we kids followed him down to the bank like he was the Messiah, leading us to be baptized. He grabbed that rope and began pulling up, and a couple of the bigger kids pulled on it with him, along with Ed's drinking buddy, Ed Wilson. After quite a bit of grunting and groaning, Cousin Ed and the gang fetched the thing up out of the deep hole, and the trap burst to the surface like some German U-boat. There must have been 50 of those cussed crustaceans fighting and gnawing those fish heads in that trap. They'd almost picked the heads clean. I couldn't believe it. They were having a crawdad fish head feast, and nearly every crustacean on the South Yamhill River was in attendance. Ed Wilson let out a howl when he saw the catch. He took both of the heads, wrestled that thing up to the top of the bank, and us kids followed them like fresh converts up from the River Jordan. Several of us got back in the back of Cousin Ed's pickup truck, and the two Eds got in a cab, rolled down their windows, and began singing as we drove across town. Us kids joined in and sang too. What you gonna do when the lake goes dry, honey? What you gonna do when the lake goes dry, babe? What you gonna do when the lake goes dry? Sit on the bank, watch the crawdads die, honey, baby mine. We poked at the crawdads with sticks while we were riding and singing and yelling with all the kids up on the sidewalk. It was great fun watching the crawdads squirm around in the wire pot, poking at them, trying to get them to take a hold of the sticks, and then when they did, pulling them up to the edge of the cage and knocking them off again. When we got to Grandpa's, he had parked along the side of the house, and the two Eds carried the pots with the crustaceans to the back door. And Grandma brought out the big bucket, and Cousin Ed opened the pot, tipping it on its side, and the crawdads came tumbling out into the bucket. After a couple dozen came out that way, the two Eds took turns grabbing a hold of the creatures and dropping them into the squirming mass already in the bucket. By the time they emptied the trap, Grandma's huge bucket was full. Cousin Ed carried the load into the kitchen, looking at the boiling wine, and dumped them in the canner, smacking his chops, howling with delight. I remember standing up on a chair watching the muddy-looking creatures turn a deep crimson as they boiled in the murky nectar. By the time the crawdads had cooked, everyone in the neighborhood knew about the feed. I wish I could have charged admission. I would have been one rich kid. Grandpa and Cousin Ed pulled the cooked creatures out of the boiling pot and put them on platters, and Grandma took them to the front porch while Ed Wilson opened bottles of Grandpa's home brew and passed them around to the adults. People started tearing into them, eating the tail sections first, sucking out all that delicious white meat, and then using nutcrackers, breaking apart pinchers. It seemed like everyone had a crawdad story to tell. So we sat there until the sun went down, cracking crawdads, eating them and drinking and telling tales. But the best part was the last. Grandpa brought out the pot the crawdads were cooked in and was about to throw it on the yard when Ed Wilson stopped him, and the two Eds took turns tipping the pan and drinking the wine the crawdads were boiled in. I thought I was going to be sick. The two Eds eventually passed out and slept all night on Grandpa's porch. Grandma threw a blanket over them, and I remember them snoring in two-part harmony most of the night. See that fellow with a pack on his back, honey. See that fellow with a pack on his back, babe. See that fellow with a pack on his back. He's got more crawdads than he can pack. Honey, baby mine. Cousin Eddie and Uncle Bud strumming and singing went on late into the night. I don't think they missed a single old-time tune they knew. And the family loved them all. For a while, Aunt Alice came over and sang with Uncle Bud on such ditties as Lonesome Valley, Birmingham Jail, and Hand Me Down My Walking Cane, and Grandpa's favorite, You Are My Sunshine. I'm not sure what the fascination was with that twangy music. Maybe it reminded all the relatives of the hop yards of the Willamette Valleys in the 30s. Or maybe it took them back to when they lived in the mountains of Tennessee, especially Grandpa and Grandma and the older aunts and uncles. For me, it was just the family and the joy and sorrow you could hear in the music. Whenever any of my friends were around or when I was at school, I wouldn't even admit to listening to it. I want to read a little bit from Following the Wrong God at Home, all right? The opening on the thing, so you get sort of a feel that those of you who haven't read any of it all. Let's see if I can find a copy of the book first. Okay, here we go. All right. Are you ready for this? Okay. At the Sheridan Mennonite Church, a rifle scope crosshairs centers on Steve Marker, a 25-year-old draft resistor. Steve stands in the box church steeple gazing at the federal officer's rifle. Mary Hostetler climbs up the ladder and is helped by Steve off of the ladder. I forgot how nice it is. The view is from up here. All I see is federal officers with rifles pointed towards me. Why don't you come down? We have soup and sandwich. How about a beer? I can't help you with that. Steve gazed down Monroe Street towards the intersection with Bridge Street. Maybe the feds will let me watch the Veterans Day parade before they lock me up. I'm sure they're aware of your history with the parade. Hey, that was Jimmy Joe who threw stones at the mayor on the horse. Mary smiled. Your nonviolent nature now is obvious to me, but probably not to them. Federal officer with a megaphone pointed it towards the steeple. Steve Marker, you have 5 minutes to come down and out of the church, or we will come in and get you. I've been given sanctuary by the church, and you have no right to enter. You have 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Steve opened the lid leading to the ladder and helped Mary to the ladder. Several minutes later, Steve stepped down from the ladder to the floor of the church. Amos Hostetler, the minister of the church, and Mary, his wife, were waiting for him at the landing. Steve stepped towards the front door. "I'm going out." Amos stepped in front of Steve. "There's no need. They'll destroy your church. The doors are strong and thick." Steve laughed. "I don't want them to damage your church." Mary touched Steve's shoulder and smiled. Amos and Mary put their arms around Steve, and all three of them walked to the doors. At the doors.
I'll get it.
Battery. Here's Mikey with the box brownie camera that my mother shot for years and did so much wonderful pictures for the Street family. And little Mikey has it with his army jacket on there in 1944 or 45, something like that. This photo I love with my father and I. This is Dad in his garden, and I'm down there kneeling beside him, and it's his first year back that he could plant a garden after World War II, and I feel so deeply for that, and Dad, and his feeling of goodness of being able to plant a garden and not to grow something and not destroy it, Of course, as a medic, he didn't destroy it anyway. This is a photo I couldn't believe that my mother shot. This was after a parade. For the parade, this is my cousin Steve and I. Steve's birthday, by the way, is today. And I was dressed up as a girl, and my mother got me to dress up like a girl for this thing. To this day, I don't know how it happened. Well, anyway, the judges for the Phil Sheridan Parade looked at it, and they gave Steve first place for the boys, and they gave me first place for the girls. And I looked at him and I said, "I'm no girl!" And then they gave me second place for the girls, and I lost a bunch of money. And then, well, I should have got first plus. Anyway, so my mother, I to this, how I consented to do it, that's the thing that bothers me. All right, what else?
Hello. I think it's working now.
It's working? Okay.
Sorry about that, Michael.
All right. Dee-doodle, 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 dee-doodle. Where were we there? Mary put her arm around Steve, and all three of them walked to the door at the front of the church. And Amos removed the reinforcement of the door and unbolted the lock. Steve reached for the door and opened it. And this is how it all happened. That's a good transition. I like that. The door of the gymnasium of Oregon College of Education burst open, and Steve Marker rushed out in the college's red and white cap and gown to the outside, and then Steve rushed to the open doors of his grandfather's dilapidated junk barn with all the auto parts, and to the cheering of friends and family who had waited hours for his arrival. Steve, three lifetime buddies encircled him and put their arms around him and led him to the table where a bar had been set up, and poured 4 glasses of champagne, and Jimmy Joe stepped forward to make a toast. From his years of working in the junk business, his attending college, and and receiving a degree in teaching humanities from OCE. Here's to Steve Marker, the junk man's grandson. The crowd tipped their champagne glasses while Buddy Vince shot photos of Steve and the spectators. Then Grandpa Street came forward with a glass of champagne and thrust it in the air. Steve is the first in our family to graduate from college, and I'm damn proud of him. Here's to my grandson. Grandma Street and Steve's sister Jenny came forward and hugged Steve along with Grandpa, and the crowd cheered. Jenny continued taking photos. The crowd converged on Steve, congratulating and wishing him well. Steve talked to several friends and then noticed that Reverend Amos and his wife, Mary Hostetter, and Mary's sister, Dorothy Miller, had entered the barn. Steve walked over to them. "Welcome, welcome," Steve said, shaking Amos's hand and hugging him. "Congratulations," Amos said. Mary put her arm around Steve, and so did Dorothy. Mary asked, "Well, what are your plans?" Steve replied, "First, to find a teaching job. I'll probably work the summer for Grandpa." "Do you have a school or town in mind?" Dorothy asked. "It would be nice to have something close, but at this point, I'm not going to be picky. I don't know what the market is right now. I'll probably take anything that's offered. I have a temporary job teaching in Sheridan High for the year, but I hope to switch to Western Mennonite next year," Dorothy said. "Sheridan isn't good enough for you?" Steve said, smirking. "Are you trying to pick a fight?" Dorothy responded quickly, frowning. Steve laughed and put his arm around Dorothy. "You know you're my favorite person to fight with, and always will be." "My boyfriend is teaching in Western Mennonite, and I hope to join him there," Dorothy replied. "Too bad you're not an English teacher. I'd be after your job," Steve said, smiling. "I'll bet you would," Dorothy said, pulling away from Steve. "Have some punch and thanks for coming," Steve said. Steve walked back to where his buddy stood, and Denny knew her to take more photos. Then Steve's Uncle Bud walked over and put his arm around Steve, and together they moved to the front of the crowd, and Bud spoke. "To my favorite nephew, Steve, I'm giving my military jeep, and I'm making him custodian and caretaker of the stump ranch and cabin off of there on Rock Creek Road." Bud handed Steve the title to the jeep and the key to the cabin, and they hugged. "Uncle Bud has been like a father to me. Thank you for the jeep and the job. I've grown up with that cabin. It's my Walden dwelling in the hills. I will always cherish it as I cherish you." The crowd cheered just as former classmate Gary Williams and former football coach and teacher Mr. Davenport walked into the barn. Steve walked over to greet them, and Steve and Gary shook hands. "You did it, Guy! I knew you would," Gary said as he hugged Steve. Steve turned and faced Mr. Davenport and shook his hand. "I've heard good things about your progress, and I want you to know that we're proud of you. We at Sheridan High School want to salute you for what you have accomplished," he said. "Thank you, sir. Are you planning a career in teaching?" "I am, sir," Steve replied. "Good. Are you seeking interviews?" Davenport asked. "I hope to start next week," Steve said. "Would you like to start with an interview at Sheridan High School?" Davenport asked. Steve smiled. "I would, sir." "Could you make it next Monday at 10 a.m.? "Yes, sir," Steve replied anxiously. "Good. We'll see you then," Davenport said, smiling. As Davenport turned to leave, Gary Williams approached Steve. "I'll be at school Monday. Stop by and let's talk." Steve shook hands with Gary again, gripping his hand hard, and they parted, and Gary walked out with Mr. Davenport. Jimmy, Joe, and Dennis walked up to Steve and grabbed him. Jimmy Joe got right in his face. "Do you really want to stay in this broken down, dead-end town?" "It's a beginning," Steve replied curtly, pulling back, and then Dennis stepped forward. "I thought we all planned on getting out of here as soon as possible." Steve moved right in front of his buddies. "I don't plan on living here forever. Besides, I have a cabin and a piece of land to take care of now." Lawson walked up to where the three buddies were standing. "What if we venture up to the stump ranch tonight and celebrate?" I'll bring the beer, Jimmy Joe replied. I'll bring the snacks, Lawson chimed in. I'll bring the dessert, Denny said. Steve put his arms around his buddies. I'll bring burgers and buns. And let's get out of here. Steve turned and shook hands with several friends. Before buddies moved toward the exit, Steve stopped briefly to tell his grandparents of the plan. It was dark by the time Steve gathered things up at home and drove to each of the buddies' homes and picked them up in the Jeep on his way up to Rock Creek Road. The four guys sang and drank beer. I said, Louie, Louie, no, said, we gotta go. I said, Louie, babe, said, we gotta go. Steve brought the Jeep to a jolting halt right in front of the cabin. At the crest of the hill, and beer spilled from the guy's bottles, and he cried out. Jimmy Joe hit Steve on the shoulder and yelled, been driving long? Sorry, it's been a while since I've driven this. And Steve got out and walked to the cabin, unlocked it, and then began barking orders. Jimmy Joe started a fire in the fireplace. Denny, pick up some wood. Lawson, help me in the kitchen. The guys worked diligently for an hour and a half, putting food on the table, and then they ate like starved refugees. After dinner, they sat in front of the bright fireplace, and Steve made popcorn while Jimmy Joe opened more beer. It was a cozy evening outside, and the lights of Sheridan glimmered in the distance. Jimmy Joe threw popcorn at Steve, hitting him in the head. I still think you should talk to Davenport. Tell Davenport to forget it. Steve threw popcorn back at Jimmy Joe and said, wait until you graduate from Oregon State and want a teaching job. You'll jump at the chance to teach in Sheridan, Steve said. Teaching is for people who can't do the real thing. Give me a contract to play ball for the 49ers. I wish you luck. Okay, that's it. Any questions, any comments, anything?
Will you write a screenplay for me?
What's it about?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a joke on that.
Gang warfare in Sheridan? No.
It's a period piece about 1994 high school students.
Karen.
I got one. You know, when you write about Sheridan, it's like love letters. When you write about your hometown. And I grew up all my years in Salem, and I don't feel that way about Salem. And what is it about Sheridan that is so powerful for you and makes it, I don't know, your heart is so invested in your hometown?
My heart, what?
Your heart is so invested in your hometown in Sheridan. What is it about Sheridan that's so special to you?
You know, with all the relatives, with everything in Sheridan and the people, it was close, you know? I've got some stories. I've got one thing that happened to me over here on Water Street. I was about 5, 6 years old, something like that. And I like to play with matches. And so I ran around with a Mennonite boy. There were two of them, they were really bright kids. And so we were playing over there in the bushes in this big field. So I started playing with matches with our toys and everything, and then, Jesus, it just flared up, you know, and I thought, oh my God, it's going to burn the whole neighborhood down. So somebody quickly called up the fire department, and they came out and everything, and they got it out, and then the fireman came over to me and said, what was going on here? I said, well, I saw Lloyd Roberts, and he was my best friend at the time. I saw him running away from the place. and then my friend, the little kid, said, no, Mikey did it, Mikey did it, Mikey did it. But we could have burned out the whole neighborhood. I could have. Never forget that thing. Anyway. Yeah, you know, I shouldn't say this. I think that Sheridan has changed a lot since I was growing up. And I don't know how much of it has to do with the prison that is built out here. It seems like, you know, there's more, and I shouldn't say this, there are more deadly things happening. Of course, it's happening all over the country and all over the world now, you know. It doesn't have this feel.
We're trying to get it back.
There you go.
We're trying to get it back. We are succeeding.
Yes.
We're determined.
Yeah.
Question.
Yeah.
Who in your family owned the Markee Feed Company, and was that in Sheridan?
No, that was in Lincoln City, and it was right by the outlet stores across the street from there. And my grandfather, well, the Markees moved to Sheridan when my dad was in the 2nd grade. And they lived up Mill Hill, just outside the country there. And my dad communicated he either ran or bicycle every day to school until he graduated. And he and his 3 brothers, all of them older, they all graduated from Sheridan High School. And my father, I couldn't believe this, but he lettered in 4 sports for 4 years at Sheridan High School. He was an amazing sort of person, and his older brother, Gerald, went to Linfield College, and he became a coach and everything, very successful in milk and free water. And Dad started college at Linfield, and he finally dropped out. He couldn't handle the working thing and going to school at the same time, and married my mother, and got drafted. So, but the thing is, my grandmother Markee's father was owned part of Ivy's Hardware for years, and he would have educated my father too, but he died 2 years before my grandfather graduated from high school. So my father, I still think to this day, I said, what a great coach, what a great teacher my father would have been. But it didn't happen. Any other questions, comments? Well, thank you for listening
Mike.
to all my That's fun. I should have been a singer.
He asked me to come up here.
Reunions in the streets and everything, and he played the guitar for years. He and my mother would sing together. In fact, both of them, during the Depression in the 30s, all the streets would go out to pick hops, and then on weekends they would have a dance over by What?
Independence.
Independence, thank you. Yeah, over by Independence, and my mother and my uncle would sing together at the dances all the time, and then they went into Portland and competed too. They did quite well, but right up until both of them passed, every time they got together, I filmed them singing. Bud finally gave away his good guitar, and I still have my very valuable. I spent all one summer at the Sheridan Granary when I was in high school, working, and every cent I made went to making to buying a Martin guitar like Elvis Presley has, and I still have the guitar, but I don't play worth a damn. All right, thank you.